Good afternoon to all. Honorable Chief Guest, Dr. Graham Wall, Senior Lecturer, Department of Mathematics, University of Portsmouth, England. Our HOD, Mrs. Jose Francis, all the teachers and participants. I heartily welcome you all to this session of Logified 2021. It's day 2 of Logified 2021, and we come to the most important and long-awaited session of the webinar series. As we begin with this session, I invite our HOD, Mrs. Jose Francis, the flag bearer of this webinar, to deliver the welcome speech.
It is an honor and privilege for me to welcome Dr. Graham Wall, who have experience in the field of operation research and transportation. Today is actually talking about green logistics. You know, logistics actually provides a lot of opportunity to us, and it can be called as one of the flying careers in the world. Especially this person have a lot of experience in explaining the new trends that is related to green logistics. He is a senior lecturer in Department of Mathematics and member of the Logistics and Operational Research Group at the University of Portsmouth. His research interests include transport and the environment, supply chain management, and green supply chain and logistics. He have normative academic background with a degree in mathematics, master's degree in operational research, and PhD in transportation. He gained around 14 years of experience in the area of transport research, and he also worked for 6 years at the Transport Research Laboratory. And he also have 4 years at the Transportation Research Group at the University of Southampton. He worked on a number of EU government and commercial consultancy projects in the areas such as transportation, public transport, high-speed rail, first priority, urban traffic control, and junction design modeling. Currently, he is working on a project which is looking into reducing the cost of the offshore wind energy and optimizing the maintenance schedules for the wind turbines. And his research areas mainly include supply chain management, applications of research in transportation, logistics, and renewable energy. So we are extremely happy to welcome you, sir, for this session.
Thank you. I will just share my screen. Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, and particularly thank you to Professor Josie for your kind remarks. And it's great to be joining you here for your webinar, for this particular webinar. I was going to say good morning because it's morning in the UK, but I know it's afternoon where you are. And I'm going to spend this time going through a case study about green logistics. And Josie just mentioned a few minutes ago that I've been doing a lot of research into the logistics of offshore wind energy. And I thought that would be a good topic for me to share with you today. And I know in India, there are some plans for 17 offshore wind farms off the coast of India. And so it's a new area that's been developing. And I wanted to share some of the experience that we've had here in the UK and some of the research that we've done within our logistics group. You can see at the top of my slide, we have a centre for operational research and logistics where we do a lot of research in these areas, particularly of logistics and supply chain management, looking to apply mathematical methods to see if we can optimize various aspects of the logistics process. Just before I get onto that, I wanted just to show you a picture of Portsmouth. For those who aren't aware, Portsmouth is on the south coast of England, and it doesn't always look as hot and sunny as this, and it's certainly not as hot and sunny as where you are, but it's a port. This is the Spinnaker Tower. It's a very famous landmark. You can get ferries to France and to Spain. And one of my main roles is that I'm the course leader for the Masters in Logistics and Supply Chain Management. And we've welcomed a number of students from India. And our course runs for 12 months. We have intakes in October and February. And if you want to find out more, you can look at the links at the bottom of the slide. One is the website looking at the particular course page. Another one is a promotional video that I did about a month ago. So if you want to get more information, please feel free to contact me. So green logistics, what is it? Well, we know logistics, don't we? The 5 rights. So we need to ensure our goods and services arrive, and we've got those 5 R's, in the right place, at the right time, in the right quality, at the right quantity, and at the right price. And so very much traditionally, logistics and supply chain management has been all about cost and about the economics. But much, much more now, the focus is on society, but also on the environment. How do we ensure that we make sure our operations have a minimal effect on the environment and have a good effect on society? So how can we ensure that? So this is what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to just focus on an introduction about offshore wind, look at some of the economics, some of the logistical challenges, supply chain challenges. I'm then going to look specifically in a bit more detail at 2 of the phases of offshore wind farms. First of all, the operation and maintenance, and then the decommissioning at the end of the wind farm's life, and then think a little bit about the future. So here's a picture of an offshore wind turbine, and it looks very beautiful. It looks blue sky, very calm. The reality is that these could be 30 miles or 50 kilometers or so out to sea. There can be different distances from the coast, and the conditions can actually be quite hostile. You've got a lot of salty water, very windy, can be very rough waves. And so they do need a lot of attention and a lot of operation and maintenance once they've been installed. And the UK is the world leader. It has over half of the world's capacity. From 2020, there were over 2,000 turbines with a power generation of over 10 gigawatts. And that powers 4.5 million homes annually in the UK. And certainly last year, that comprised of around 10% of all the UK electricity. And there's been a lot of focus going forward. Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, has been trying to push more investments going forward into more offshore wind farms. And as we'll see, costs have actually fallen significantly, particularly over the last 5 years, which has enabled the offshore wind market and the numbers of turbines to be installed to increase significantly. This is a map showing the UK and where a lot of the wind farms are. And a lot have tended to be on the east coast of England traditionally, but you can see now that they're in a variety of places, and there's a concentration also on the west coast as well as the east coast of England. So why are we interested in offshore wind? Well, there's a number of reasons. Environmentally, it's renewable, it's sustainable energy, it's clean, it doesn't emit CO2 emissions at its source. It tends to be relatively unobtrusive, particularly if it's far out to sea. And it also provides a very secure form of energy for the UK. We're not having to import energy in. And being a coastal island, it's an excellent resource for the UK. And the planning permission has been quickened up. And it's part of the target for the UK, which was to achieve 15% of renewable energy of its mix by 2020. There are some problems, and the key one is the weather. If we have wave heights above 5 meters or so, then it's impossible to actually get to the turbine to do any repairs or any maintenance, or even install or dismantle it. So weather is a very, very big issue and can cause problems when we have a number of weather days where the wind farm is not accessible. Some wind farms, people feel they are a bit visual intrusion if they're very close to the coast. There are issues as well with bird life and migrating birds. It can affect defense radar equipment. Fishermen are not so keen because it requires an area that they lose for their fishing, although that provides a very positive environmental gain in the fact that we have a sort of a marine area where fish and other marine life can flourish. Shipping lanes, again, they need to be sited outside of shipping lanes. Wind in its nature fluctuates. There can be winds, there can't be wind. So as a result, the generation of electricity is very much intermittent. But there are ways that the electricity can be stored and used at other times. So that improves the reliability. So one of the key things has been the costs. Now, it seems that with wind energy, there should be no cost at all. The economics should be wonderful. But I think through the experience, particularly of offshore wind energy, there's been shown to be a lot of costs that maybe weren't foreseen at the start. And back in 2009, these are figures for, you can see that offshore wind energy was much, much more expensive comparatively to other forms of electricity generation, particularly fossil fuels like coal or gas. And so because of that, it wasn't competitive. And that was a restriction in rolling it out and increasing the size of the market, because offshore wind really started in pilot projects in the UK in around 2000, that sort of time. And you can see how costs initially started to rise, particularly till about 2015. And there's a number of reasons for that. Some of the early sites were picked because they were very near to the coast. You had shallow water, they were easy to access. But some of the later wind farms tended to be much further offshore, which meant it took longer to travel to maintain. And in addition to that, they were in deeper waters, which means they require what's called deeper monopiles. They're the concrete posts that are used to embed them into the seabed. So again, all of this increased costs. And I've just put a few costs here just to show you. There's the capital costs, which increased and doubled between 2004 and 2009. And you had then what's the OPEX costs, the operation and maintenance costs, which work out approximately 20 to 25% of the whole life of the wind farm. And so you did have a situation about 2009-10 where it was costing, this is in UK money, £140 per megawatt hour. And the government wanted to see that reduced significantly to 100 megawatt hours. And it's actually the latest figures, and we'll see why, is actually now down to £47 per megawatt hour. And so you can see the progress that has been made and how that has meant that it now can be very competitive and the size of the market can increase. And this graph shows how costs have reduced over time significantly, particularly in comparison to other forms of electricity generation. And the red line is the offshore wind. Okay, so initially, I think one of the lessons learned is that offshore wind being a new concept, a lot of costs maybe weren't anticipated. And I think as things are rolled out and developed, there's a learning curve, and you improve and continuously improve and find ways to make things far more efficient and see costs reduce. But a number of factors led to costs increasing and being high, particularly material costs, labor costs, currency fluctuations, the costs of installing, particularly the foundation costs. That's one of the key issues with offshore wind farms. There's significant costs to actually get them into the seabed. The operation and maintenance costs as well are significant. And there were a number of issues with the supply chain, which I'll come on to in a minute, and finding further sites required moving further away from the coast and into much deeper waters. This shows some of the costs broken down for an offshore wind farm. And you can see the turbines are the key cost, nearly 40%, foundations 12%, the cables and networks 19%, and the operation and maintenance 23%. So you've got some quite significant costs here, particularly ongoingly as we continue. Once the installation has happened, there are still significant costs in maintaining and keeping them operating. So what about the logistics? Well, these turbines are significant. Some of them may be as high as 200 meters, and the blades are significantly long as well. And so how do we transport them to the port? How do we assemble them at the port onto vessels? And how do we then make sure that we can get them out 30, 40 miles off coast into the seabed? And you can see some ways that they've tried to transport them by road or rail, but many places in Europe now have manufacturing facilities for the turbines actually at the port, so that they can then be made at the port, assembled, and then put onto a vessel. And the vessel that you see in the bottom right is called a jack-up vessel, and this is used to install the turbine into the seabed. So the supply chain caused a number of issues in the early stages, and I've put a number of points there, and I'll just highlight a few of them. As we've mentioned before, because we have a situation where costs were rising, a number of developers wanted to have subsidy. They wanted help from the government financially, but the government wanted to insist that the industry reduced costs first before the government stepped in. And so you had this situation where the developers wanted financial incentives, but the government wanted to see the industry bring costs down significantly. And so again, that caused some delays to the development of the offshore wind industry. You had a number of issues as well. Very little coordination between different entities within the supply chain. You had the market dominated by just a few suppliers. In fact, in the UK, there was no turbine manufacturer until very recently, which meant that all the components had to come in and the turbines be imported into the UK, which meant you had some quite complex, geographically diverse supply chains, and there are a number of bottlenecks for particular components as well as a result of all of that. I think one of the other issues is that we wanted to see, this is a new industry, so where is the labour? Where are the skilled people who can take up these positions? And that required much more training of the workforce in the relevant skills. And importantly as well, it needs public commitment and public support in order for this to go forward. Just one final thing, a lot of these wind farm developers had what was known as lump sum contracts. And because of that, they're paid a particular price for doing the work. So there's very little incentive for trying to optimize, to try and reduce costs. So that this has changed over time. And so there are more incentives to try and improve and reduce costs. And these are some of the cost reduction measures. The main thing that's increased or improved is the fact that the turbine sizes have increased, far more powerful now. And so you're getting much more energy being generated from a turbine of slightly larger, but not significantly larger. They're much more efficient and much more able to generate much larger quantities of energy. A lot of the parts and the processes have been standardized as well. We've now got many more players within the market to actually make things much more competitive. And there is a sharing and more of a collaboration between developers, particularly in things like components. And through continuously improving and learning, there's been a lot of ways to try and optimize various aspects of the process. So for example, where you've got cabling, you can try and optimize the amount of cable being used to connect all the turbines to a facility on shore. You may also want to think about how you optimize the vessel routing, how you enable engineers or technicians to get to the various turbines and then be able to get back to the shore with the minimum distance. How you also schedule your workforce, again, in the most efficient way. And this is where a lot of mathematical methods can be used to help. I've just put up here a map showing, or a diagram showing wind farms and what some of the maintenance. So onshore, you will have some form of place where the wind farm is connected to the electricity power lines. There'll be a port where the operation and maintenance will happen. And depending on the distance, you will have different strategies with regards to accessing the wind turbines using a variety of different transport modes. And if the wind farm is very close to the shore, it's most effective to have small vessels going on a regular basis to maintain the turbines. Some of these vessels only carry about 12 passengers. If it's much further out, there is the use, although very expensive, of helicopters, particularly for emergencies. But you may also have what's known as motherships, which are larger vessels which are stationed out to sea for longer periods of time so that maintenance can happen at a number of wind farms much further out from the coast. And whenever schedules happen, these wind turbines will need a regular service, probably at least once a year, but then obviously there is maintenance going on a regular basis. And this is where we need to think about the logistics and we need to think about the costs involved. With regards to maintenance, do we want to be focusing on preventative or corrective? Do we want to focus on being more proactive in our maintenance or more reactive? And it's a bit like having a car. When you drive a car, do you just repair it when it fails and when it stops working? Or do we try and have regular services to make sure it doesn't get into that position to start with? And obviously when a wind turbine fails and stops working, then there's a lot of problems. Obviously it's not generating electricity. There is no revenue coming from that turbine. And in addition, if the weather is not suitable, it may be difficult to access that turbine to repair it for quite a period of time. And so you need a combination here of preventative and corrective. And for preventative, there are what we know as condition-based monitoring. And there are a number of systems that are located within a wind turbine, sending back data. And that data then can be analyzed and then can be looked at to see whether there is some form of failure likely to happen in the near future. but also preventative on a time basis. So every few months, the turbine would be checked to make sure it is operating correctly. And a wind turbine is complex. It has over 8,000 different components. So there's lots of things that can go wrong. One of the ways to try and reduce maintenance is by making the components or parts of the turbine into complete pieces, which are very much in bed, and where you're trying to ensure that seawater or other elements from outside can't get in and cause rust or damage. And I've just shown this chart, which shows a number of parts that are used in a wind turbine and the failure rates or their frequency. And in the blue bars, this shows the consequences or the downtime. And what we can see at the top is that things like electrical systems fail more regularly, but the consequences are quite minimal. Whereas if you have, for example, a gearbox or a generator that fails, then that's much more serious and can mean the downtime for the turbine is much more significant. And if you have something like a gearbox failing, it may not just require a small vessel, you would need that larger jack-up vessel to be able to carry out such a repair. Okay, I want to just mention, we think about green logistics and we think about society. So the question is, if you're living near the coast and there's an offshore wind farm off the coast, how is it benefiting the local community and society as a whole? And one of the ways that this has happened, a number of schemes, and I've put a link at the bottom which you can look at for some sites off the coast of Scotland, is that the local community, if they're happy and give permission for it to go ahead, they can access cheaper electricity. There are also benefits in terms of local training, apprenticeship schemes, new jobs being created. As a result of the wind farm being in the local area, particularly having to access the port and a number of other aspects of it, then the local services, facilities and infrastructure can be greatly upgraded, which again can affect and improve the community in that area. A number of places have set up visitor centres or tourist boat trips, which again have benefited the area as well. And there's also been a number of ways in which the wind farm developers have engaged universities and colleges to improve educational engagement. And also a number of developers have set up community funds as well to help the community in different ways. So there have been a number of attempts to try and see the societal benefits of offshore wind farms as part of not just the economic benefits, but benefiting society as a whole. And obviously the electricity being renewable has a big impact on the energy, green energy, and reducing the environmental impact of the electricity being generated. Okay, I just want to move on and talk a little bit about the decommissioning now of wind farms. And this is a particularly important area currently. And I've just shown a picture here of some quite dilapidated, rusty, at the end of their life, wind turbines. These are onshore, these are not offshore. And these are in America. And one of the problems was in America, there was a very big rush for a lot of developers to build and install onshore wind farms or wind turbines on land because the government was giving a lot of subsidy. But what happened was that when they built them, they weren't very well built. They started to fail quickly. Parts were expensive. And after a period of time, the developers effectively left and went, and the landowner effectively was left with all of the problems of having to clean up the site. and the developer didn't have the responsibility for cleaning up the site. And so a lot of lessons have been learned, particularly offshore, to make sure that the environmental aspects, particularly of cleaning up after the end of the life of the wind farm has happened, make sure that those are in place. And so one of the things that any developer is required to do if they want to install and build a new offshore wind farm is they need to have a detailed decommissioning plan. This is a plan to show how they will clean up at the end of the life of the wind farm, which is roughly, or is estimated to be roughly, up to 25 years. The problem is, because, as I mentioned, wind farms only really started in the year 2000, so there's been very little experience up to now of actually decommissioning any wind farms. And so it means that plans that are produced, costs tend to be underestimated. It's very difficult to predict what the timescales should be. One of the things that developers need to provide is a financial security. So they build up a fund over the lifetime of the wind farm, and that's secured to pay for the cleanup at the end. But within this process, the developer has to put in place an environmental impact in every area, but particularly in the decommissioning, to make sure that they're dealing with things like waste and recycling at the end of the life cycle of the wind farm. But the choice at the end of 25 years isn't just necessarily to dismantle or to decommission or clear the site. There are options.
Sir, sir, I request you to please unmute your audio. Sir?
Okay, is that better? I can't.
Yes, sir. Now it's all right, sir.
I'm okay now. Okay, that's fine. Okay, let
Yes,
me just
thank you,
go back to this again.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Sorry. So as I was saying, we've got the decommissioning plan isn't just about disabling the wind farm, but can be about extending its life, either by repairing turbines. We can repower the turbines, change them to make them more of a higher standard, of a higher power, or we can dismantle. So there are a number of costs involved in all of this process. So we need to think about putting this plan together, developers, in order to estimate the costs, the schedule, how long it will take, making sure they have the money available to do it, but also consider very much the impact on the environment and thinking in particular about waste management issues and recycling. Particularly the environmental aspects are very important. There's some examples here of the decommissioning. These are some small sites that have been decommissioned so far. This one is Denmark, where there were 11 turbines decommissioned, and you can see it lasted 26 years from 1991 to 2017. Another one in Sweden, where there was 7 turbines, and this only lasted for 18 years. And again, small scale turbines, some of the early turbines that were put up. And then the first one for the UK in Northumberland, off the coast of Northumberland in northeast England, was just 2 turbines, and these lasted for 20 years. So there are some of the limited examples so far. And you can see from the costs, it was initially estimated that the cost would be around £40,000 per megawatt, or equivalently to 2.5% of the total project cost. And a lot of those costs are very much involved in some of its offshore preparation, but removal of foundation, 35%, that's a big cost involved, but also in terms of the disassembly and the offshore preparation, and also the various hire of vessels. So this puts up all of the costs involved. And you can see here how the costs are starting to build for a number of wind farms, because a number now that were installed 20 years ago or so, or just less, are now starting to think now about this, what's going to be happening at 20 years, 25 years. Will they have to decommission? Can they repower? Can they repair? And so there is what's known as an asset evaluation carried out to see what the next steps will be. This was one particular wind farm off the coast of England, and they estimated £109,000, which was significantly higher than the £40,000 per megawatt. And new studies have shown it can be up to, this is in euros, but could be up to potentially £500,000 per megawatt. And so you can see how costs, because experience is so limited, costs could be much underestimated and could be much more significant in doing what's required at the end of the life cycle of the wind farm. So there are a number of key logistical decisions that need to be carried out, and I've listed a number here. So what do we do? Do we repower? Do we repair? Do we decommission completely? When do we decommission? What season do we do it in? Normally the summer is the best time. Normally we have to decommission everything, but normally above the seabed, because trying to get anything below the seabed, like cables up, can cause a lot of environmental damage and can also mean that there's significant extra economic costs. But we need to also think about the logistics in terms of the staffs required, technicians, the vessel requirements, what we need in terms of port requirements, and also how we will carry out the recycling and waste management. And in terms of the recycling, a wind turbine, most of it is made up of metal. So these can be easily recycled and reused, as well as lubricants and things like that. The main problem is the composites. This is what's made up of the tower of the wind farm and also the blades. And these have tended to be just cut up and burnt, which is far from suitable. And so innovative ideas have had to be looked at to see if we can reuse them in different ways. And this is one idea, using them for a children's play area. They've also been used maybe in buildings, or other ideas is maybe in road surfaces as well. So we need to think a bit outside the box about how they can be used. Another big area is what happens to the wind farm at the end of 25 years. The part that's below the seabed has actually encouraged a lot of wild marine life. And you can see here, this is an oil platform in America. And you can see over the years, it's developed a lot of marine life attached to it. And around the wind farm, it's built up almost like a marine park, a marine area. So the question is, how can the environmental benefits of that for the marine life be continued at the end of the life of the wind farm? And one of the possibilities, instead of having to dig it up, is maybe cut it at the seabed and then leave the remaining part of the wind turbine, the bit that has been under the water, leave that just on the seabed. And that's what they do in America for some of these rigs, oil rigs, where they clean them up, but then they leave them and they become effectively like an artificial reef for marine life. So that could be one area that could happen in the UK. And for that, I've just listed here a decision tree in terms of deciding what to do, whether you leave it in place or remove it. And if you remove it, do you do it partially or completely? And what are the conditions where you could safely relocate it to deep water to keep the environmental benefits for marine life? Okay, just want to finally conclude by saying a few things about the future. One of the problems with offshore wind turbines, as I've mentioned a number of times, is that you have to use these monopiles and embed them into the seabed. And it's very costly. It's logistically very challenging. So one option, particularly in parts of coastline where you've got much deeper water, is to use what's called offshore wind turbines that float, so floating wind turbines. And these have been trialed and used in various parts of Europe. And this could be a way of saving money and also reducing the impact on the environment as well. So this is one area that's been looked at and developed quite significantly, particularly in coastal areas further offshore where you've got much more deeper waters. Looking forward, again, you've got these future energy islands. This is one that's being proposed off the coast of Denmark. So again, where you've got a whole focus of renewable energy, and again, having this concept of energy parks. So as well as having offshore wind turbines, you could also have, for example, wave energy turbines or tidal energy turbines. So making the most of the marine renewable energy resource that is available. Okay, I've put up some references here for you to have a look at if you're interested, okay, which focus on this. Just to conclude by saying that a lot of the work that I've explained today has been carried out as part of 3 different projects that we've carried out for the European Union. One looked specifically at optimizing operation and maintenance activities. One was looking to see how we can make sure that the social and economic benefits of offshore wind and the environmental benefits benefit local communities. And another one was looking at the whole of the life cycle of the wind farm and looking to see how you can improve the efficiency, reduce the costs, and reduce unnecessary processes in the whole process from design to decommissioning. Okay, I think I'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you for listening, and I will stop sharing my screen.
That was indeed an enlightening session. It was a chance to explore the diverse aspects of a unique eco-friendly approach to logistics and could also provide a new perspective to the present day concerns associated with logistics and transportation. Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, no
It's
problem.
now time for an interactive session. The participants can voice any doubts, queries, or clarifications.
Sir,
Yes.
sir, a simple doubt. What, according to you, made UK the first?
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
Sir, what, according to you, made Kingdom the first?
Okay, what the first in developing offshore wind energy? That's a good question. I think it was partly because I think, again, I'd have to check up my answer here to look at a little bit of the history of how it began. But I think one of the main issues is that we are an island, and we have it is very windy a lot of the time, and so there is a key resource there. So that's one. I think that's one big driver. I think another key driver is that obviously focusing on the environment, particularly, there's been a lot of focus on renewable energy, and particularly coming off fossil fuels, things like coal and gas. And our coal and gas supplies have reduced significantly as well. And so they aren't so much of an option. So there's been a lot of active looking for alternatives. I think as well, nuclear energy, as we know, there's been a lot of issues and can be problems with nuclear energy as well. And so the governments have been actively looking for alternatives to replace some of our traditional methods of generating electricity. I think as well, being an island, the UK want to have a secure supply of energy, not to be reliant on importing energy from overseas. I think probably a lot of those factors led to really developing and looking at the whole area of offshore wind. I think probably one other factor as well is there are wind turbines onshore, as I've mentioned as well, but the UK is quite a densely area, and so wind turbines, people don't like wind turbines being close to them, and so the options of having then to do it offshore became more important. So I think conditions and drivers.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Sir?
Yes.
Well, I'm Deepthi. I'm a student, and even I study logistics. Sir, I have a question. Sir, you have talked about how logistics works in UK while transporting the parts of windmills. So my question is, here in India, we are having very challenging weather conditions and relief features. So it makes it difficult for us establishing wind farms in various places. So can you give some suggestions how we tackle this problem or how we can overcome this here in India?
Right, in the transportation in particular. So just rephrase what you were saying again. So particularly in the transportation and the logistics of setting them up. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, because we are having, challenging relief conditions as well as our weather conditions are really bad at times. So it is difficult for us. Yeah.
It is difficult. Yeah. I think it is challenging. And as I mentioned, I think one of the transporting wind turbines and the blades are very difficult by road. It's not impossible, as I showed. There are ways they can be transported, but as they're getting larger and larger, that's becoming much more difficult. So I think the idea of having manufacturing wind turbines near the port is definitely the way forward. And recently in the UK, we have a new facility in a city called Hull in the northeast of England where that is happening. And that reduces any need for any transportation by road or rail to the port. That certainly helps in that situation. In terms of the logistics of getting them out to sea, as you say, if it's very windy, I know it can be you can get some quite major storms where you are, and it's very difficult in that situation how you maintain and how you develop them in that situation. I think in the UK we may only have around 10 weather days a year, so it's not majorly significant. But again, that would need to be looked at with India. I think this new technology of having energy islands may be one of the things for the future. And so if you can get to the island, then you can then service them all without any issues of wave heights and winds in the same way. So that may well be a future way of going, particularly in places where the weather is not so suitable and you're going to have a lot of weather days potentially. So I think the idea of whether these energy islands, like they're planning in Denmark, may be a really good way of using and developing wind turbines. And also you can have bases there then for the operation and maintenance, and you're much nearer to where you need to be to do the operation and maintenance and repowering them when they need to be.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question.
Good afternoon, sir. Hello.
Hello, hi there.
Sir, I have a question. What is the most stressful part about the green logistics? Can you please explain?
The most stressful, sorry, the most stressful part.
Yes, sir.
Is this in terms of the offshore wind farms, the stressful part? Okay, I think probably the most stressful part, I think, for offshore wind developers is probably this uncertainty of knowing when they can actually access their assets, access the wind turbines, because there may be situations where a number of wind turbines are not working, but because of the weather, they're not able to get out to them to repair them. So obviously that's one big factor and one big issue. I think, and obviously weather is uncertain, and so you're having to deal in that uncertain situation. And so how you plan and resource that and make sure you have a good schedule to deal with that, I think is probably the most stressful part. I think as well as that, there are a lot of unknowns as well, because a lot of wind farms, some wind farms have been proposed, but then, and a lot of money spent, but then they found that the geology of the seabed is not suitable. Okay, or another option is where the local community have not been happy for the wind farm to be located there because it affects their view, or it's near to a marine park. And so again, there's uncertainty there. So developers are a little bit more reluctant to put a lot of money in initially, because they want to wait to see that they've got community approval, the planning permission approval, but also all of the geology of the seabed and the construction of putting them in is able to go ahead. And so there are a lot of uncertainties all the way through, which I'm sure do cause some stress. But I think now that there's been a lot of practice of actually putting in offshore wind farms, particularly in the UK, then there's a lot more expertise, and so they're able to overcome some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for those clarifications being clear.
Yeah.
Thank you, George, sir.
Yeah,
All
no
the
problem.
participants are requested to duly submit the feedback forms. The certificates will be issued only upon the submission of the feedback form. The participants are also requested to ensure that the details are filled in properly. As we come to the end of the session, I invite Mrs. Neha Ann Varghese, faculty in English, and for the vote of thanks, ma'am, please.
A very warm good morning to the respected chief guest, Dr. Graham Wall, and a good afternoon to all others gathered here. Today is indeed a special day, a day that marks the culmination of weeks of planning, organizing, and efforts as we come to To the end of this two-day international webinar, we owe thanks to many who helped us achieve this long-cherished dream. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Graham Wall, the esteemed guest of the day, and a resource person for an extremely informative session on ecologistics. The very concept proves to be one of great future implications in the developing scenario. He has brought in a new outlook to the field of transportation and methods to combat its associated negative impacts on nature. Dear sir, we are also grateful to you for sparing time from such a busy academic schedule, and that too early in the morning. Thank you, sir. It was a great honor, sir, to host your talk and to be acquainted with you. In fact, several of our students are looking forward for a seat at your university, and I'm sure this talk would have inspired them definitely. Thank you once again, sir. Next, I'd like to thank our director, Reverend Father Dr. Matthew Vatata, CMI, and our principal, Reverend Father Jish Putasheri, in their absence, for their constant support and guidance in all our endeavors. Thanks and regards is due to all the participants who have supported and encouraged us with their presence and active participation on both days. My heartfelt gratitude to our HOD and a very dear colleague, Mr. Jose Francis. I do have to acknowledge the immense efforts he had put in to make this event a reality. The technical team, headed by Mr. Joe Jacob, I thank you on behalf of the whole department for the services and support without which the event wouldn't have been possible at all. And finally, I extend my gratitude and appreciation to all the faculty and student coordinators for bringing this event into such a grand execution. Once again, I thank you all. I hope